Welcome to the Creative Industry Insight podcast, a podcast that looks at various roles in the creative world. I'm your host, Bobby. Today's guest, cinematographer Stephen Murphy, joins us to talk about their work on Atlanta Season 3. Please be warned there are heavy spoilers in this episode, so sit back and relax as we jump into the conversation with Stephen. Hi, Stephen. Thank you for joining me today.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for having me.
I'm very happy that we were able to organize something for you to come on and talk about the third series of Atlanta, specifically the Eurocentric episodes. Again, Atlanta is one of my favorite shows, so being able to talk to someone about it and the whole creative process behind it is really exciting for me. So I guess the start should start from the beginning. How did the project come about for you?
So it came to me via my agent. Originally, Atlanta was going to shoot, or season three of Atlanta was going to shoot about a year earlier than it did, but COVID happened and that delayed it. And the original plan was that the cinematographer who shot season one and two and season four, Christian Sprenger, he would come over and shoot it. And when it came time for them to do the European episodes, his partner was going to have a baby, so he couldn't leave the States. He needed to stay closer to home. So they needed to look for somebody else. And my name got thrown into the mix. I did an interview with them and sort of got a call the next day, and I was jumping on a plane pretty quickly after that.
It's weird how we have certain series of events that put you into frame for certain jobs, but then on top of that, just how you must have interviewed extremely well if they were that next day asking you to jump on a plane and go meet them.
I think maybe it's a little bit of Irish charm helps.
Well, no, that again, we were speaking before and hearing the accent, there is a charm to it. But even that they're getting you on to the plane the next day says a lot about yourself and what you're going to bring to the table as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think with some projects, with most projects anyway, you know that when you're being interviewed, you're with, many getting interviewed. And if you if you're, you know that a decision is going to be getting made at the end of the week, for argument's sake. And if you're the one who is getting interviewed last, then maybe getting a call to say, hey, go out, we want you, is one thing. And if you're getting interviewed first, maybe you wait a little bit longer to get that answer. But yeah, it was great. We kind of clicked very well, myself, Hero Marai, and in the interview. So we had a lot of the same references and sort of liked a lot of the same things. So it was nice to get asked to jump on board so quickly.
Well, when you click as well with someone, it probably makes their decision easier and creates excitement amongst both of you to work with each other. What was the pre-production like on something like this? Because if you're having a American crew come over to Europe, what sort of obstacles and hurdles did that create? And how did you want to create a look for the show?
It's kind of we're sort of in an era now where we all travel so much that there's less of sort of an American versus European, aesthetic or way of working. It's Hero's been to Europe before. I've worked in the States before. You very quickly sort of I think if you get on, you very quickly find a common language between you. And, it doesn't really matter where you're shooting so much. There's always certain local idiosyncrasies that you kind of have to take on board. But I found that if I'm shooting in Germany or if I'm shooting in the States or if I'm shooting in, France, or like a grip is a grip and a gaffer is a gaffer, and everybody sort of, there's common traits, I think, to everybody around the world who gravitates towards certain roles in the film industry. And it's I think the the key is to try and find that sort of common language, the thing that connects you on a project. So when we started prepping Atlanta in London, we talked about some references, but we more Hero and I talked a lot about two cinematographers, Gordon Willis and Harris Savides, and we talked about their work, not so much trying to copy it or ape it, but we talked about how they worked because they had a kind of a particular way of working, which was more about say in Harris Savides' case about lighting a room, not lighting a shot, and Gordon Willis his own particular way of working. He was attracted to very considered frames, and he wasn't afraid of darkness, and he didn't mind if an actor was almost completely in the shadows, as long as you could get the right sense of the story from the shot. And I'm a huge fan of their work, and it's you can see it all the way through all the work that I do. It's part of what I love about cinematography, and Hero is also a big fan of their work, and we liked how they worked. We talked about how they approached something rather than looking at an image and saying, I want Atlanta to look like this. And that was the beginning of the conversation. And the conversation always about, how something looks always evolves during prep, and it evolves as you're shooting. It's always being influenced by something that happens the day before, or a location that changes, or a location that you found, or fantastic paint that the designer has used on a wall that when you see it in real life, you go, oh my God, it's amazing. It is a tapestry that is constantly changing little bit by little bit. But those conversations about those other cinematographers and how they worked were sort of the beginning of our conversation about prep and about how the show could look. And we obviously talked about how the show had looked in season 1 and season 2. And then a huge influence is the locations and what our designer, Jonathan Paul Green, brings to the table. And so as he's finding locations and, scouting for things and we're looking at them, that influences the look in a big way, because you're sort of reacting or responding to a space that he's found, that is maybe bigger or smaller than we sort of had thought it would be when you just read the script on the page, but you realize this is a great space for that scene. And then that space influences maybe how you then see the scene that follows or the scene that comes before. So it's a constantly evolving conversation.
I love hearing about the influences that you guys were looking at, and especially the cinematographers, because then when you're now hearing about it and then thinking about in certain scenes how you guys did use the darkness to hide, not necessarily to hide, but to propel the story. So I think one example that pops to mind now is the episode called New Jazz, when they enter the Cancel Club, and just the way that that whole place is lit, that even though it's sort of a dark, shady bar, spoilers for new episode New Jazz, there's certain reveals in that space that help push the character along to understanding where they are or what's happening. And on top of that, having Liam Neeson there as well, kind of come out the shadows, which also shows sort of more of a, should we say, a darker underbelly of the what's going on.
You read that scene on the page and it reads like one thing, and then we found that and went and had a look at it, our location manager and designer and Hero and myself, and you go, okay, wow, this is incredible. And I mean, that's a real location in London. It's a real club. Obviously we've art directed a little bit, made our changes to it, but the space itself, the staircase, that's real. The stage, it's got a very particular vibe to it. And then, you look at that, and certainly to my mind, there's sort of influences from David Lynch in there. There's a little bit of The Shining in there. Like, it's a great tapestry of texture and color in that space. And it worked really, really well. I couldn't see that scene happening in any other space, even though when you read it on the page, you don't think of it that way. But I think it's a mark of how well the location's been chosen and dressed and lit, when it feels now that it feels just like it's the right that it's the only choice.
I think those things, again, as you said, work out in a weird way with having just that right space. But even I think your idea of how to shoot it, or even how everything's designed or read differently from a script to then having a location changes perspective as well. But I think what I found on this season as well, whilst in Europe, how different each episode looks. There is a certain look and feel to it, but when you have character-driven episodes, so I've forgotten the episode number, but it's the one where they end up with the tree, how
Mhm.
that looks, because you could see that's predominantly London based, but then compare that
Mhm.
to the last episode when they were in Paris and how the sort of look and feel, the look in terms of what's being captured and graded, where it's all muted is the same, but I feel like the use of lights and the look of the locations being looking like they're, I think you quote this is a quote from you as well, is that they're lit for location, not for the subject in the frame. So you do really show off what's going around rather than just having the audience member focus on the person in front of them.
Yeah, I mean, part of the beauty of the series is that from episode to episode, it can change genre or mix genres, and it does it really, really well across all three seasons. I'm sure the fourth season will be the same, and that gives us a lot of freedom to kind of, we have a sort of a certain, I'm going to say certain set of rules that kind of carry across the episodes, but maybe rules is the wrong word. But yeah, the season is, has a visual consistency, but it also has the option for each episode to have its own visual style. So, and we did talk about that a lot in prep. We did sort of we did this thing for Old Man in the Tree where, I was quite keen to try and create little visual rules for us to work towards or base our decisions from, and we could deviate from those rules. When we did deviate from those rules, but by having a kind of a visual spine to work from, it helps give a kind of a consistency to the episodes. But on Old Man in the Tree, for example, we didn't move the camera very much. It's very considered. On Cancer Attack, the camera moves a lot because a lot of the scenes require more a flowing camera, sort of a bit more energy to it. Terrar, the final episode in Paris, is a very different feel. It feels very much like it's a sort of the whole episode's on the move, and that's got a very different energy to it. But within all that, within those episodes, you still have the sort of we had this little lens rule that we tried to shoot, and I would say we successfully shot most of the European episodes with basically just three lenses. We kind of picked a lens language that we liked at the beginning, and was the 27 mil, the 35 mil, and the 40 mil. And most of the time, we didn't deviate from those lenses. We put a lens on one of those three lenses, and instead of saying, "Oh, we want to be tighter," or "We let's put a different lens on," we would keep that lens and we try and move the camera a little closer. Or if we wanted to be wider, we'd keep the lens and move the camera back a little bit. So it made us think about the relationship between the camera and the actor, or the camera and the space, more than just switching lenses to try and go wider and see the corner of the room or whatever. That visual consistency from those lenses really helps tie everything together and kind of makes it all feel a little more considered. Even though within all that, you could have, like I said, the variety of the Steadicam being used a lot in one episode, or handheld in another episode, or very static camera in another episode. But that lens language is was kind of a useful, spine that threads its way through all of the episodes.
Because you have your lens choices and that you've already you can have a consistency and also a language created. Does that make it easier for you then once you're shooting to know what you want to choose, what you want to pick, and then to just stick with those decisions? Or was there a point during the shoot where you're thinking maybe we should have had another lens in our arsenal?
No, not really. I mean, the way, funny enough, the sort of limited lens, approach is something. you, or certainly I, end up doing quite frequently, but not always consciously. I mean, on most shows, you obviously, to cover yourself, you'll carry a full range of lenses, and if you've got two cameras, you're going to have two full sets of lenses, and within that choice, which is basically infinite, you still end up gravitating towards certain lenses most of the time. And I had a focus puller said it to me years ago. We had been working together a long time, and he could predict the distance I'd be at and the lens I'd be on for a close up, after several years of working together, because it was just something that I would gravitate to, not even consciously. I was on whatever at that time, whatever lens it was, and it was at whatever distance it was always. It was always more or less the same. And I think a lot of people end up using, if you're carrying 10 or 12 lenses for in a set, you will end up using three or four of them most of the time. It's not always conscious, choice. It's a lot of the time you just it's what your sort of subconscious taste is bringing to the project. I mean, we in our case, we were, if our three lens thing wasn't working, we would happily just say, fine, great, go on a lens wider, go on a lens longer. And we did do that. It's more that the idea of that limited lens discipline is a kind of a nice rule to anchor yourself to as you're making the film, but it's not something that you have to be super rigid about. It's just a nice starting point for the conversation. Instead of saying, hey, we're looking at a scene, we could shoot it on any lens in the world, any size we want, we've got infinite choice. It's more that you go into the scene thinking, okay, this is the perspective that we're trying to take. Because a lot of it is about perspective. It's it would feel different if we suddenly shot an episode of Atlanta on a 10 mil lens or a 6 mil lens. That would be a very different perspective to see the story from. Whereas we wanted a more neutral perspective, that let the story play within the frame, wasn't necessarily super wide, and equally wasn't super long lensy. We weren't sort of trying to impose or imply a psychological or an emotional quality to the lens choice. We were just presenting the story from a particular perspective.
That's interesting to hear as well. And when you have a certain amount of lens choices and what the rest of your team sort of discuss and understand from it all. I think there was a point where I read in an interview as well where you've decided to light and this is what you mentioned earlier as well, light the scene according to the location and not the subject matter. And it says as well, it allows people to be a bit more creative and improvise the scene more. But what I'm interested as well is that having that unpredictability of an actor and not having a mark for them to hit, how hard was it for you guys to capture what was happening and following the actor if they're improvising the scene?
Oh well, it's easy. I mean, there's probably maybe a slight misunderstanding in the sense that the improvisation happens in the rehearsal process. It's not, so by the time we're actually committing to something, essentially the actors are hitting marks, but they're not being told to have to hit that mark, in the rehearsal process. The rehearsal gives, I can light the space. We know it's going to look great, this way, this way, this way. And, Hero comes in, he rehearses with the actors. They find the light naturally, or they find the edge of the light, or, the fringes of the light, which is often the best place to be rather than directly in the light. And if they want to change in the rehearsal process, we've got total freedom to let them go wherever they want. And then by the time you're doing take one or take two, they're pretty consistent, about where they're landing. So it's not like we say, oh hey, it's take one, you can go anywhere you want, and we're just going to follow you. It's definitely not that. It's a more considered approach. But the idea behind lighting the space, not the face, is that it's better, it's more realistic, maybe is the way to put it, lighting wise. It's very easy for us to, have a big, beautiful, soft light, key light lighting the actors perfectly every time they stop at a mark, or stop at a window, or sit down at a table. And for certain movies, for lots of movies or TV shows, that's what the aesthetic that's wanted. But it's more interesting to me to see somebody move through a space and, like I said, sort of catch the broken light, or the remnants of light, rather than this sort of perfectly placed light. You still need to get some light on them. You still need to light them to some degree, but you're trying to create a reality that is a little more authentic, but still moody and still dramatic and still interesting to look at. And that's kind of the process that we're trying to, or that I'm trying to achieve, by following that sort of, you know, that guide of light the space, not the face, which is very much a Harris thing that he talked about a lot, and loads of other cinematographers have sort of been influenced by that.
Oh, okay. Because I always thought that sometimes you would, even though you'd rehearse it and people would improvise, they would also sometimes ad lib on and throw a curveball. But I think if they're doing the improvisation whilst rehearsing, then it probably makes it it makes it more understandable.
And
What,
it's sort of, that would be the physical improvisation. Obviously, any verbal improvisation is sort of different, but at that point, usually the verbal improvisation might come after the physical improvisation has sort of settled down, and people have found a groove of, yeah, this feels good. It feels like I need to get up at this point, and walk over here and get this thing, and then walk back over here. That sort of, that physical thing, you know, that gets resolved in the rehearsals, or by take one. And the if somebody suddenly decided, okay, you know what, I'm getting up now at this point, I'm going to get up the table, I'm going to walk over to the bar, and if they're off their mark by a foot or 2 feet, that's not the end of the world because of how we've lit it. On another job, you might find that you need to very precisely land on a mark. So, they have some freedom while we're shooting to not quite hit the marks, but it's not kind of as free form as you sort of described at the beginning.
okay, okay. Well, that makes a lot more sense now and helps me understand the sort of movement of it all and the idea of what people are doing. So there's something maybe this was just me watching it a little bit closer because I was going to talk to you about it, but there's something I noticed in the series that when there's those human moments where actors are talking about where the characters are talking about certain points where they open up. So I think in Cancer Attack, you've got Paperboy who's sitting and talking about his phone and
Mm-hmm.
why it's so important to him. You have it in episode 10 where Van talks about everybody has their own thing,
Mm-hmm.
except for her. What I noticed was that there's the way it's shot is that there's a very shallow depth of field to what's going on. So instead of you as a viewer seeing what's happening in the background or note something in the background, your concentration is solely on the actor themselves. Now, was this something that was planned from the beginning, or is this something that happened on the day?
No, no, that's a conscious decision. It's something we talked about at the beginning. Talked about with Hero at the beginning. It's just something we wanted to do. Again, as you said, it's for sort of focus. To literally focus your attention. We actually did it. We shot at quite a shallow depth of field for most of the show. It's just that you begin to notice it a little bit more on those close-ups or those moments, because we are, in both those cases, we're very physically close to the actor, and we're on the 40 mil probably for the close-ups rather than anything else, and so you appreciate the shallow depth of field a little bit more because of just the way the physics of the lens works, the mechanics of the lens.
Oh, okay. Because I think especially in episode 10 with Van, if I'm not mistaken, you're by the Eiffel Tower. So
Mm-hmm.
it's quite amazing to think that even though you're by the Eiffel Tower, your concentration and thing is on the actor themselves and not
Mm-hmm.
on the location, which is location itself.
Yeah, that was a very conscious choice. So Donald directed that episode, and it was one of the first things we talked about was the idea that, we knew this scene was going to happen on the banks of the river, and we didn't want to do the touristy version of Paris, where you have the Eiffel Tower in there. The Eiffel Tower is in the back of the shot, but it's you only see the bottom legs of it. We sort of want to throw it away almost, as if sort of seeing the Eiffel Tower from the perspective that a local would see it from, where they're kind of so used to it that it's just not, it doesn't register. And it meant that the whole scene, the focus of the entire scene, is about the performance that's happening. I mean, the camera is obviously super still. It's very simply shot, and that's the appropriate way to show that moment. You've had this episode which has been full of energy, where we've been racing around Paris, seeing all these crazy things, and then finally, then you get to a very static moment with the camera, with the actors, and just giving a great performance. And yeah, it's very simple. It's very beautiful. It's exactly what the scene needs, visually, no more and no less.
I think this leads to my next question as well, because in the series you do work with more than one director, and obviously you're all working to one goal. But what does what does that entail for you, being working with multiple people? And on top of that, you're working with people who are so close to the project because they're not just directing, but they also are producers or creators of the show themselves.
For me, certainly I'm used to working with multiple directors across a show. A lot of the times you're hired on a job to be the consistent visual voice across many directors. In TV, that's kind of quite common. But on this particular project, because Hero and Donald are almost two halves of the same brain, they work together incredibly closely. They complement each other really, really well, and they have a circle of collaborators that they work with. So Ibra, the director I had on one of the episodes, has written for Atlanta. He knows Donald very well. He knows Hero very well. And then Stephen Glover, Donald's brother, who's a writer and exec producer, he's always there as well. He's in the background. So they all work really, really closely, and they all know the show really, really well. And they if they talk about stuff with each other, they talk about scenes with each other from across each of those episodes. They're very collaborative in a very nice way, in a very good way. So it means for me that I'm starting the show with Hero, doing a couple of episodes with him, 4 episodes with him, then I do an episode with Ibra, and then I finish an episode with Donald. So by the time I've kind of gotten through, or started working with Ibra and Donald, I've already done 4 eps with Hero. I've got a great sense of what the show is, and I'm able to incorporate Ibra's ideas and Donald's ideas as well. And so it all feels consistent. But they are already very consistent about how the storytelling happens, because they know the show so well.
Okay, because I was always thinking that once you're, I guess when you're working with everybody has the same goal, but there's always somebody's going to bring their own style on top of that, and also their own stamp on the show.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, if you look at, there's a big difference between Terrar, the final episode that Donald directed, and Old Man in the Tree. The one you talked about where they end up at the tree at the end, and Hero directed that. And visually, there's a huge difference. Old Man in the Tree is, like we said, very considered sort of static frames. It's a very different kind of storytelling to Terrar, which is race around Paris, but they still feel of a whole because of the storytelling intent behind them, because of the approach to the characters that they both take. It's amazing how different and yet similar they are, and existing in the same world.
what I do want to sort of ask as well, that I've noticed is also wasn't shot because there's a show itself looks like it's been shot on film. Was this digital or shot on film?
No, it's digital. But we do a lot of work with Ricky, the colorist, in the grade to get it feeling like it's been shot on film in terms of the way the grain structure sits on the image and things like that. So it's that grade is something we test in prep, and we expose the camera in a particular way. I mean, I heavily underexpose the sensor, and I filter it in a very particular way to kind of get a softer, sort of more muted color palette. It's a little smokier too, which helps push it towards feeling like it's film. And then because we're shooting on sort of slightly vintage lenses, the Primo optics are from the 80s, and I use them wide open. It sort of softens the image as well, gives you some artifacts around the edges of the frame, corners of the frame. And then Ricky comes in and does a lovely color pass on it and works with the grain structure through the grade, and that all sort of sits together and helps it feel like it was shot in film.
So you're talking about as well the grading, and it's
Mhm.
something that's decided with your camera tests and in the pre-prep. What does the color grading consist of, and how do you work with a colorist to perfect the look before going into filming?
I mean, the grading is sort of same for most of the projects. Different DPs use the grade for different reasons, maybe is probably the best way to put it. But I am very keen to capture as much of the look of the final look in camera as possible. And so for me, the grade is about getting the best version of the rushes, the best version of what we've captured, not necessarily, changing anything, or you're not creating, a look in post. You've got 80% of the way there in camera, and the grade is the last 20% of us. And if we do our job right in camera and on set, and if we do our job right in post in the grade, then the grade complements the photography perfectly, and you kind of don't feel it. It just looks like an analog image. I think there's others out there that on other jobs would probably rely more on the grade than I would normally do, and that gives you a different kind of look. But to my mind, I always sort of feel that look a little too much. It feels a little overly manipulated. So yeah, so for me, the grade is always about complementing the photography. We get all the sort of color balance the way we want it on set. We get the density the way we want it in camera, and then Ricky applies his grade to it all, which just helps it all sit together really nicely.
What are your sort of initial discussions with a colorist, and what is it that because you must sit down with one another and then go through, not well with a camera test, it probably isn't that many scenes, but is there a way where how do you communicate what you want changed or what you want added?
It's sort of different. Again, it depends on the colorist, depends on the DP, and it depends on the job. It's different from job to job. What I tend to do is shoot a bunch of tests and then go into the DI suite with the colorist and show them the tests, and then talk about what I'm trying to achieve. And just because of where I've come from, in that I've grown up with film and film processing and film printing, I still treat the grade as a kind of almost like the printing part of an older analog process. So I tend to talk a lot about things like silver retention prints or ENR prints, things that were used in the sort of mid to late 90s and early 2000s and the sort of end of the photochemical era. I'm very much into print stock, and that's usually my conversation with a colorist. In the case of Atlanta, because Ricky had done season one and season two, which already had a look, and I knew what they were going for. Again, it's a nice printy look. There's really good contrast to it, and nice strong grain. So what we did was we took the look that they had used in camera on season two, and we used that as a starting point for our tests on season three. And then we modified it a little bit, and sent those results back to Ricky. And then because he was in LA at the time, then he graded them and came up with a season three European LUT, for lack of a better word, which is very similar to what we were doing or what they were doing on season one and season two, but had enough of a difference to sort of incorporate what I was trying to go for with the European Fs.
I guess for lack of a better term, having that European va-va-voom look. But sort of leading to wrapping up the episode, I want to sort of just with my penultimate question what was your favorite location and favorite scene to shoot?
So there's so many choices because we had so many good locations and so many good scenes. I love doing the scene on the at the end of Terrar on the side of the River Seine. That was amazing. It's always really impressive to see a really emotional performance like that and see it live for real. You kind of always know you're sort of in the middle of making something special, when you see that. But you know, I mean, I loved the location we had for Old Man in the Tree. There was so many good stuff. It was so many good things on that show. I don't know if I've any one particular favorite scene. I've so many fond memories from the shoot. It was a really great shoot with a really great bunch of people. Yeah, I don't think I could pick. I've been asked before what was my favorite shot in it from a technical point of view, and from a purely technical point of view, there is a scene in the New Jazz episode where Brian, Paperboy, he's being chased in Amsterdam. He's been chased by a bunch of kids. He steps into a dark room to hide from them, closes the door, and it's a pitch black room, like literally pitch black. And he hears somebody crying in the adjacent room and sees a little bit of light. And he slowly walks into this other pitch black room that has a single pool of light in the middle of the room. And there's a woman in white clothes, a very pale skinned woman, kneeling down in that pool of white light. And obviously, Brian has very dark skin and he's wearing a dark costume, and she's wearing very bright white costume. And it's this contrast of pure black and pure white. And it's really beautiful. And Brian is massively underexposed. There's just the tiniest sheen of light on his skin, and he looks amazing. And she's heavily overexposed, and she looks amazing. And then as the scene develops, you realize there's other people in that black room, and it's an audience watching this performance. So, from a purely technical point of view, to get that to work is really tricky. And I'm super proud of it because I think it came out really, really well. But it's not something any audience will ever think twice about. And it's, as a location, it's literally a black box with a light in the roof. So there's nothing, it's not like it's an incredible room or an incredible space to light. It's just a really interesting technical challenge that I'm very happy with.
Whilst you're talking about new jazz, it's dawned on me another question, if you don't mind me
Oh,
asking.
yeah.
But after just sort of discuss this, I think when you're talking about that scene, it's when you think about it as well, and you look at it, it's quite striking you're stepping into that world where Paperboy has no idea what's going on, and that when you have him in that darkness, it can be very confusing for anybody themselves when they're like that, and not sure what's going on. But then when you're slowly revealing what's happening, it's at first as an audience member, it's what the hell is going on? To then you kind of chuckle a little bit because he's disrupting a performance and the people are trying to shoo him away, and he doesn't realize that he's doing it.
Yeah, yeah, it's great. And it's a great scene. It's a lovely scene. It's a really nice little moment. And Brian is a pleasure to work with. So he makes doing tricky stuff like that super easy. And it turned out, like I said, it turned out really, really well. I love favorite stills that I pulled from the work I did is him just coming into that dark room, and there's this tiniest amount of light in his face, and his eyes just catch the light, and it's just gorgeous. Looks amazing.
Whilst you're talking about that episode, there is a question that popped into my mind, and that is when you're doing certain shots where in the edit they will jump cut to a different location. Whilst shooting from one location to the other, how important is it that you match the shots whilst working on it? And how do you plan for that from reading in a script to executing their movement from one location to the other?
It's very important that they match. You obviously don't want to take the audience out of the story. You know, you don't want them to be aware of the fact that you've moved from one side of Amsterdam to the other side of Amsterdam when you pass through a door. But a lot of the time, it's a conversation with the designer where they will bring some physical elements from the B side of the location, for argument's sake, to the A side of the location. So in our case, in that particular scene, for example, we're in the red light district, and he runs down a street, he turns a corner, and he steps into a doorway. And when he steps into the doorway, that's at the red light district. But when he turns away from the door and walks into the other space, that's in a completely different space somewhere else. So what Jonathan did was he took part of that space that's somewhere else and he built it into the doorway at the red light district. So you have some overlap, and then you work out with the director how you're going to plan your shots and plan the transition and plan where the cut is. That's stitches the two scenes together. So I mean, and we did it in a really simple way, and it's all about like the timing of Brian closing the door, and you overlap that action, and it works really well.
Because I always thought that you both as an editor and what you're capturing in your rushes will have to work in tandem, and also the idea of just how difficult that might be, because as you said, capturing the timing of them closing a door, walking through a door, also not being too jarring with what's going on in front of them as an audience member. Just to wrap this episode up, what's next for you?
So at the moment, I am in New York prepping another show that Donald Glover is involved in, called Mr. and Mrs. Smith. I'm shooting a couple of episodes of that, and that will keep me busy for most of the rest of the year. Yeah, so that's what's next.
Cool, that sounds exciting. I'll look forward to keeping an eye out for that, and hopefully have you back on to talk about that once it airs.
Yeah, no problem, no problem.
Great.
It's out next year. See you then.
Stephen, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. I really
You're very
appreciate it.
welcome. No problem. Thanks for talking to me.
And then for those interested, Atlanta's streaming on FX in America and streaming on Disney Plus in the UK. Stephen, thank you again.
Cheers. Thanks, Robert.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.